This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Daniel Ricciardo's F1 career has consisted of what is looking like a series of poor career choices. In 2018, he left a Red Bull team that was offering him a race-winning car to go fight it out in the midfield as he looked forward to these 2022 regulations. From the early part of the season, it hasn't looked good for Ricciardo or McLaren. There are some signs of improvements, but is time running out for the Australian driver in Formula 1? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The reasons Daniel Ricciardo deserves his seat in Formula 1. Daniel Ricciardo made an instant impression when he was promoted from Toro Rosso to Red Bull for the 2014 season. He had beaten their four-time world champion Sebastian Vettel in that first season, and as a result, he was stepping up into the lead driver role at Red Bull as Vettel moved on to Ferrari. At this time, Ricciardo was 25 years old, with great career prospects, and many described the Australian driver as a future world champion. This was a logical presumption, given Red Bull had won 4 championships in a row between 2010 and 2013, and that Ricciardo was the future of the team and a driver that they could build around in the new turbo hybrid era. Ricciardo was at Red Bull during a tough few seasons, but the Australian driver continued to prove why he was a great driver, with regular podiums and occasional race wins with the team. But after a number of difficult years for Red Bull, where they failed to mount a title challenge, they were once again looking for a new driver to build the team around, and they found that in Max Verstappen, who was promoted to the team in 2016. So from that point, Ricciardo had a challenger, especially once the young Dutchman won a race for the team at the first time of asking. And all of a sudden, Ricciardo's prospects were changing. But regardless of that, he was still a hot prospect in the sport. Red Bull's Christian Horner has recently revealed that the team offered the Australian driver a stratospheric contract to remain with the Red Bull team beyond 2018. But he continued to look elsewhere and rolled the dice to move to a midfield Renault team for 2019. The fact that Red Bull was so desperate to keep him shows the value that he holds in the sport. He's a proven race winner and a driver that's incredibly likeable, which isn't essential, but I can imagine is a great factor that the teams look at when they're bringing a new driver into a team. What Ricciardo achieved at Renault was fantastic. He went to a midfield team with big ambitions and comfortably beat his teammate through both seasons. In his second year in particular, he brought the Renault team back to podium finishes and was able to get the absolute maximum from his car. Once again, Ricciardo's stock was high, and actually between those 2 seasons at Renault, he made the move to McLaren, taking advantage of the open opportunity with Sainz moving on to Ferrari. So it's clear that Ricciardo at the time was a driver that was in demand. Many teams would have wanted to sign him, and when you look at how long it took Red Bull to replace him, you can see just how much of a loss he was to that setup. And the reason for that is because of his skills on track. At Red Bull, he became known for his late-breaking moves into corners and making overtakes from distances that few drivers would be capable of matching. So the teams know that in Ricciardo, they get a driver who can maximise every opportunity that he has to make sure he progresses up the order in the races. And that's why he would be a valuable driver for most teams on the grid. There was no better example of this than Ricciardo's victory in Monza last year. Having not won a race since 2018 and having a disappointing year so far, which we'll take a look at shortly, he delivered an excellent weekend for McLaren. He qualified in 5th, just behind his teammate, with the McLaren car being at its best that weekend. In particular, the McLaren tended to be strong off the line, which Ricciardo took full advantage of, getting himself into 3rd in the sprint race, which turned into 2nd on the grid following an engine penalty for Bottas ahead of him. And from there, he looked natural at the front, getting ahead of Max Verstappen at the start and looking so comfortable back at the front of a Grand Prix. But as I say, this was a glimpse of brilliance in an otherwise tricky season for Ricciardo. But before we take a look at that disappointment of 2021 and the reasons why Ricciardo's days in the sport may well be numbered, I want to take a moment to talk about another challenge that some of you might be facing when watching Formula 1. Let's say you're on holiday, or for whatever reason, you can't watch the F1 race on a Sunday. Well, Surfshark VPN might be able to offer you a solution. A VPN is a virtual private network, and Surfshark gives you the ability to change your location and access geo-block streams. For example, you can change your location with Surfshark to Austria, and that will unblock Service TV, which is a free-to-air, officially licensed F1 broadcaster, which means you could watch every race, no matter where you are in the world, for free. Using that same feature, you can change your location to any one of Surfshark's servers in 65 different countries, and view these countries' different Netflix libraries and access even more content. As a bonus, when you're using Surfshark VPN, your personal data is protected and secured, especially when you're using public Wi-Fi, which is where your data could be more vulnerable. So if you want to get Surfshark VPN and try it for yourself, make sure you head to the link in the description and use the code DRIVE for 83% off and 3 months extra for free. And when you do, Surfshark offers you a 30-day money-back guarantee. So it's basically a free trial and you have nothing to lose by giving it a try. Make sure you head to the link in the description to download Surfshark today. Has Ricciardo declined in the last few years? So whilst Ricciardo is clearly a driver that is deserving of his spot on the grid, many have started to question his position based on the last couple of years. In particular, Ricciardo struggled to get up to speed in 2021 as he had to adapt to the McLaren car, and there was little the team could do to develop it towards his liking given their focus was on the 2022 regulations. Throughout that 2021 season, Ricciardo was off the pace of his teammate, Lando Norris, despite so many people predicting that he would be comfortably ahead. He got off to a slow start and quickly fell behind his teammate in the standings, only beating him once in the first half of the season when they both finished, with a 6th place in Spain to Norris's 8th. But a tough start to the season was summarised best by his performance in Monaco, as he was lapped by Lando Norris and ended up 12th, while his teammate went on to score a podium finish. That result showed just how difficult he was finding it to get up to speed in that car, and it was also where it emerged that the McLaren car was particularly different to other F1 cars that Ricciardo had raced in the past. The McLaren car struggled in the medium-speed corners, and the solution to this problem that Norris and Sainz had adopted previously was to brake late into the corner and apply the steering progressively through it. However, Ricciardo's driving style tends to be carrying as much speed as possible through a corner, with an early braking point and early traction on the exit. But this simply didn't work for the 2021 McLaren, as Ricciardo never got that early traction he wanted from these type of corners. For me, this exposed a weakness in Ricciardo's ability that we hadn't seen before, and that's his adaptability. Don't get me wrong, of course it would be very difficult to change a driving style that's been developed and improved over Ricciardo's long career, but given the amount of data available to him, I'm surprised he never really got on top of that weakness. One of the reasons given for this lack of adaptability was due to the lack of in-season testing, but for me, this feels like a weak excuse. Other drivers have shown that they could adapt, including the likes of Sainz and Norris in that same car, but Ricciardo failed to show that in 2021. Following that disappointment of 2021, where Ricciardo ended up 45 points behind his teammate, he claimed to have learned a lot about himself and the way that he races, as he admitted that he didn't really know his own strengths. Hopefully, that learning from 2021 has allowed him to consider that, but it feels like knowing what you're good at in this sport is important for all drivers in Formula 1. Ricciardo revealed that he doesn't pay much attention to the technical side of Formula 1. This is again very interesting for me, as it feels like a lot of the top drivers in the sport do have an interest in this department, and like to know about every element of their car and what it does, in case that becomes relevant in the race, and also in terms of giving detailed feedback about certain elements. To completely ignore this side of the sport seems to me like a bit of a risk, especially when so many drivers are keen to look for any marginal gains that they can get to be the best driver on track. Having said this, Ricciardo added that he believes that sharing feedback with the team is one of his strengths, which could surely be enhanced further if he invested some time learning about those technical areas. Ricciardo's transition from Renault to McLaren was done on the hopes of being in a position to potentially win races and the championship. For the first couple of races, it didn't look good for Ricciardo, with 14th in Bahrain and a retirement in Saudi Arabia, but things are looking slightly better following a 6th place finish in Australia. Realistically, sticking with Alpine through this transition is unlikely to have produced a different outcome for Ricciardo, so it's difficult to judge his career moves as a weakness, but this situation leads me to think about Ricciardo's future in Formula 1. Ricciardo's long-term future. Daniel Ricciardo currently has a multi-year deal with McLaren, which expires in 2023. I don't see any reason why this wouldn't play out, as McLaren's alternate options don't have the amount of experience that Ricciardo brings, but would they want to extend to another long-term expensive contract if the Australian driver continues to compete behind his teammate? There has to be a real concern over that position, especially if McLaren don't quite pull themselves back into contention for race wins or podiums. With Norris, they have a driver that is tied to an even longer term contract, and they know that they can trust him to perform year on year. So with Ricciardo, there's got to be a question raised regarding his position. He came in to replace Sainz, who was just about the lead driver during his time at McLaren, and Ricciardo has failed to deliver on those expectations as he's ended up behind Norris. Now of course Norris is an improving driver, but it does feel like McLaren's driver lineup is probably slightly weaker than it was a couple of years ago. Ricciardo's future in the sport is obviously still in his hands. He's showing signs of improvement in 2022, and hopefully the McLaren team have been able to design a car that is more to his liking this year. He's also got a couple of years still to impress, and results like the one that we saw in Australia will build his confidence in the car, and then we'll see his performances improve as well. For me, I don't think we'll see Ricciardo leaving the sport anytime soon. However, in terms of his title chances, I think that's where the big change is. When Ricciardo left Red Bull back in 2018, he had been heavily linked with moves to Ferrari. And in the end, when a Ferrari seat became available, it was Sainz who took the seat after a strong year with McLaren. It was at that moment that Ricciardo's prospects had moved significantly. Realistically, McLaren is his best chance for now, and his tour of different teams over the last 4 years or so has perhaps meant that other teams will be less likely to look at Ricciardo as a realistic option. I've got to also add, he's going to be 34 years old by the time his contract runs out with McLaren, and whilst he clearly isn't too old by any means, there has been a trend in the last few years for teams to trust younger drivers in the top teams in the sport. So given he won't have that longevity anymore, he might just need to stick with the McLaren should that option be available to him. Either way, it'll be fascinating to see how Ricciardo gets on over the rest of this season and into next year. He's got a lot to prove in that McLaren. Once again, a massive thank you to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Make sure you head to the link in the description to go and try it out today.